1975, in Fort Worth, Texas, a woman set a deep cast-iron pot on the stove beneath a yellow light. On the table were half a kilogram of ground beef, 2 cans of kidney beans, 1 can of tomatoes, 1 onion, and a nearly empty jar of chili powder. Everything cost about $2. 6 enamel bowls sat upside down on a towel, waiting for tonight's dinner and the portion set aside for tomorrow. Steam fogged the window. A wooden spoon tapped against the side of the pot, making a dry, steady sound. Beside it was a wooden recipe box with the lid slightly open. The card on top was written in pencil, "Beef chili, Fort Worth, 1975, about $2. A dried tomato stain remained on one corner of the card. The dishes in this story were created through the skill of calculating portions, saving leftovers and cooking slowly. 1 can of beans, 1 potato, 1 old bone, and the kitchen still found a way to feed the whole family. Ahead are Monday's pot of red beans, the ham bone returning to the dinner table, the chicken dish with no chicken, and the pot of beef noodles tied to memories of New England. If this kitchen reminds you of a place you once knew, subscribe and stay with us. The first card begins with ground beef, 2 cans of beans, dish number 25. Pots of beans waiting after the late shift. For baking trays and takeout containers, many working-class kitchens began with the soft rattle of a pot lid over low heat. Beans rested beneath the surface of the water, tomatoes slowly broke down, and a small portion of meat gave its flavor to the entire pot. Time did the rest of the work, so that when a pair of work boots stopped at the door, dinner was still hot, and there was enough to share. Dish number 25, beef in 1975. In Fort Worth, North Texas, the aroma of chili powder, cumin, and thickened tomatoes often drifted out of the kitchen before the worker returned home. A pot serving 6 cost about $2, including 95 cents worth of ground beef, 50 cents for 2 cans of beans, and the rest for tomatoes, onion, and spices. She set the deep pot over medium heat, added the meat, and used a wooden spoon to break it into small pieces. The fat crackled as the edges of the meat turned brown. The onion was stirred in the fragrant fat until soft, and then the canned tomatoes slid down to the bottom of the pot. She crushed the larger pieces against the side, then added the beans, chili powder, cumin, and a little garlic powder. The lid was closed, the heat was lowered, and the sauce slowly wrapped itself around the beans and meat. Whoever came home early served themselves first, and whoever finished a late shift still had a portion waiting on the stove. When the meal needed to last into the next day, she served white rice or cornbread alongside it. By the time it was reheated, the flavors of tomato, meat, and spices had blended even more deeply. Her skill lay in spreading the flavor evenly so that every bowl was filled. 1 pot, 2 dinners. Dish number 24, red beans and rice. In Tremé and Central City in 1976, Monday morning often began with a pot of beans before the wash tub filled with water. 8 servings cost about $1.85. The dried red beans cost 42 cents, the rice 33 cents, while the ham bone, sausage, onion, celery, and bell pepper created the rest of the flavor. It's on Sunday night, she had already picked out the bad beans and soaked the rest in a large bowl. The next morning, the beans were rinsed and poured into the pot with onion, celery, and green bell pepper. The ham bone lay in the center of the pot, carrying the previous day's meal into a new day. Water was poured in until everything was covered. A bay leaf floated near the rim. The heat was lowered until only the gentle trembling of a simmer remained. While the clothes were scrubbed, wrung out, and hung on the line, the beans gradually softened. She pressed a few beans against the side of the pot so that their starch would thicken the cooking liquid. By evening, white rice rested at the bottom of each bowl, with red beans spooned over the top, carrying the aroma of smoke, celery, and seasoning through every grain of rice. There was still enough in the pot for the next day's lunchbox, and sometimes even for a reheated breakfast. The bone had traveled from Sunday dinner into Monday, while the smell of slowly cooked beans became the familiar clock of the house. Monday had its own smell, Dish number 23, small white bean soup. On a cold evening in 1975 in Lewiston, Maine, steam from the soup fogged the windows of a textile worker's family home. The pot serving six cost about $1.10, with 40 cents worth of small white beans, 45 cents for a smoked ham hock, and the rest for onion, carrots, and celery. Beans had been soaked the night before, then rinsed and placed in the pot with the ham hock. Finely chopped onion, carrots sliced into coins, and celery, still carrying its green leaves, fell one after another into the water. When foam rose to the surface, she gently skimmed it away and lowered the heat. The quiet bubbling continued through the kitchen, while the skin and tendons around the ham hock slowly released their gelatin, making the broth thicker and glossier. When the meat began to pull away from the bone, she lifted the ham hock from the pot, waited until it was just cool enough, and then used her hands to pull off each small piece. Meat was returned to the pot. A few of the beans were mashed against the side to make the soup thicker. A slice of stale bread dipped into the hot broth suddenly became soft again, absorbing the aroma of smoke, black pepper, and the gentle sweetness of the vegetables. The ham hock held little meat, but it gave the entire pot saltiness, fat, smoky flavor, and a sense of fullness. Every bean carried a trace of meat flavor, even though there were only a few small pieces in each bowl. The bone filled the entire pot. Beans had sustained those kitchens through many meals. But after Sunday dinner, the leftover bone still waited for another job. Ham bones and pots that never truly end. Some kitchens looked at a leftover bone and thought of broth, a pot of beans, and one more evening with 6 bowls still set on the table. In years when every penny had to be counted, anything that still held flavor still had work to do. A bone did not end after Sunday dinner. It began another pot of soup. Dish number 20, skillet pea soup. In the winter of 1974 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a 6-serving pot of soup cost about 97 cents. The split peas cost 32 cents, the smoked ham hock cost 42 cents, and the rest went toward onion, carrots, and celery. When it was done, the spoon almost stood upright in the thick green soup. She sorted the peas on a plate, rinsed them under cold water, then put them into the pot with the ham hock, chopped vegetables, and a bay leaf. Boiling softened into a steady bubbling rhythm. She stirred along the bottom, waiting for each pea to swell and dissolve into the liquid on its own. When the meat was tender, she removed the ham hock, pulled off whatever still clung to the bone, and returned it to the pot. The next day, the soup was thicker. She added a little water, reheated it over low heat, and placed the toast beside it. On a cold night, that dish held warmth, preserved strength, and made the kitchen feel more settled. Small peas kept the kitchen warm. Dish number 21, ham and bean soup. In 1975 in Dayton, Ohio, a ham was measured by the number of times it returned to the dinner table. Sunday brought thick slices. Monday brought sandwiches. Tuesday brought scraps of meat with eggs. By Wednesday, the bone went into a pot of beans, making 6 more servings for about 85 cents. The night before, she soaked 39 cents worth of white beans. In the morning, the beans were rinsed and placed in the pot with the bone, which still held a few pieces of meat. About 25 cents worth of onion, carrots, and celery were chopped and added along with black pepper and a bay leaf. She seasoned lightly because the saltiness was already in the ham. For 2 or 3 hours, the hot water worked its way through the bone, drawing the smoky flavor into every bean. When everything in the pot was tender, she removed the bone, pulled off the last scraps, and returned them to the soup. Some of the beans were mashed to thicken the broth, and only then did she taste it again. The kitchen budget was calculated across the entire week. Every time an ingredient returned, it meant one more time the table could remain full. Nothing ended after a single meal. Dish number 20, mulligan stew around Wichita, Kansas. In 1973, mulligan stew often began with opening the vegetable drawer. 1 softened potato, 2 carrots, half a can of corn, a few green beans, and several slices of sausage were too little when kept apart. Gathered into one pot, they made 6 servings for about $1.29. She trimmed the bad spots from the carrots, cut the dry end from the celery, and divided the potato into large pieces. If she had about 70 cents worth of inexpensive beef, she browned it in a little fat. If there was sausage left, she cut it into many slices so that every ladleful would contain a piece. The onion was sautéed until fragrant, followed one by the potatoes, vegetables, canned tomatoes, corn, and green beans. Broth from the previous meal was poured in. The spoon tapped steadily against the side of the pot as she stirred in salt, pepper, garlic powder, and dried herbs. After 1 to 2 hours over low heat, the potatoes released their starch, the vegetables softened, and the meat gave its flavor to the entire pot. If the liquid was still thin, she mashed a piece of potato against the side. Mulligan stew changed with the season, the timing of the paycheck, and whatever remained in the cupboard. In hands that knew how to arrange them, scattered ingredients no longer looked like leftovers. Everything became dinner. Bones and beans had kept the pot going for many days, but beside nearly every working-class kitchen of that decade stood a large, heavy paper sack, dusty with soil. Inside were potatoes, the ingredient that would enter the next section in many different forms. Potatoes, cast iron skillets, and mornings prepared the night before. From the bones that had given all their sweetness to the soup pot, the kitchen moved on to the sack of potatoes beneath the table. The potatoes went into the pot, across the grater, and back into the skillet the next morning. The sack of potatoes gave the cook a few more days to make things work. Dish number 19, potato soup. In October of 1974 in Twin Falls, Idaho, the windows fogged as the soup began to boil. About $1.20, she made 6 servings, including 55 cents worth of potatoes, 35 cents worth of milk, and the rest for onion, butter, and broth. She peeled the potatoes as thinly as possible, cut them into cubes, and softened the onion in a little butter or bacon grease. When the potatoes were tender, she lightly mashed some of them directly in the pot. Starch thickened the soup, while the pieces left whole gave it a sense of fullness. The milk was poured in slowly, and then the heat was lowered. If there was any cheese or bits of meat left, she divided them among the servings so everyone could see some. At the end of the week before payday, that pot of soup carried warmth through the house. Potatoes kept the house warm. Dish number 18, fried potato pancakes. In Chicago's Polish Triangle in 1974, 69 cents made 10 to 12 pancakes. 29 cents went toward potatoes, 14 cents toward eggs, and the rest toward onions, flour, and oil. The potatoes and onion were grated on a metal grater. She gathered the wet shreds into a clean towel and twisted it tightly until the liquid ran out. Hands had to be firm because any water left behind would make the pancakes soft and cause the oil to splatter sharply. The drained potatoes were mixed with eggs, flour, salt, and pepper. Small spoonfuls were placed in a cast iron skillet and pressed flat. She waited until the edges turned golden and crisp like lace before flipping them. The centers remained soft and fragrant with onion, while the crust gave a light crackle when touched by a fork. The recipe was passed down through the way the towel was wrung out, the color of the edges, and the sound of the oil. She listened to the oil to know when to flip the pancakes. Dish number 17, potatoes scrambled with eggs. On a Saturday morning in 1972, in Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, cold potatoes from the night before returned to the skillet in a breakfast for 6 that cost about 63 cents. The potatoes cost about 28 cents. 6 eggs cost 24 cents. The onion and frying fat cost 11 cents. She cut the cold potatoes into small cubes and heated a spoonful of bacon grease. The onion went in first, gradually softening and turning golden at the edges. The potatoes were spread into a thin layer, pressed down gently, and left undisturbed until the bottoms browned. The only sounds in the kitchen were the singing fat and the clock ticking on the wall. Once the crust had formed, she turned the potatoes once. The eggs were lightly beaten with salt and pepper, then poured around the potatoes. She pulled the cooked egg from the edges toward the center, allowing the soft curds to cover the crisp potato cubes. Last night's potatoes had been given a new life. Patience made the crust. The recipe box was opened. One card lay crooked beneath the lid, with 3 words written on it: potatoes, eggs, fat. The brown stain along the edge of the paper had grown old, while the instructions remained in the cook's memory. She knew how long to wait from the color of the potato bottoms and the sound of the fat in the skillet. But an economical meal sometimes left the large pot behind. The next section begins with 2 slices of white bread, 1 can of peas, and finely ground bologna for the lunchbox. White bread, cream sauce, and packed lunches. Leaving behind the morning skillet of potatoes, the story moves on to smaller meals, prepared more quickly, and sometimes sent out of the kitchen before the cook herself had even left. On some days, lunch began with a slice of toast, a serving of hot sauce, the sound of a metal lunchbox lid snapping shut in a house where the lights had not yet been turned on. There were fewer ingredients, but the care remained in every spoonful, divided evenly. Dish number 16, creamed peas on toast. In 1973 in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, about 56 cents could make 4 hot servings. The can of peas cost 22 cents. The milk about 10 cents, butter and flour another 10 cents, and the white bread accounted for the final 14 cents. She opened the can, drained the peas in a small colander, and melted the butter in a skillet. Flour was sprinkled in. The soft sound of the spoon stirring could be heard against the metal bottom. Once the raw flour smell had faded, the milk was poured in a little at a time. With one hand, she held the cup, while the other stirred steadily until the sauce, which had begun to form lumps, became smooth and glossy. The peas were added last so they would keep their shape. Meanwhile, the bread popped out of the toaster, dry and golden on both sides. She placed the toast on a plate and spooned the white sauce into the center, leaving the edges crisp while the middle slowly softened. It might have been lunch for a child who came home early, an older person eating alone, or a mother preparing for a work shift that began at a different hour. There were very few ingredients, but there was still a hot dish on the table. Dish number 15, Southern style, tomato gravy. In Knoxville and the surrounding areas of East Tennessee in 1973, 4 servings of tomato gravy with biscuits cost about 56 cents. The tomatoes accounted for 20 cents, the bacon grease about 7 cents, the flour 4 cents, and the biscuits about 25 cents. After each time she fried bacon, poured the hot grease into a jar kept near the stove. When she needed to make gravy, a spoonful of the grease went back into the skillet. The flour fell in, absorbed the fat, and gradually turned pale golden. The canned tomatoes were poured in slowly, making a gentle sizzling sound and filling the entire kitchen with a sweet and tangy aroma. She crushed the larger pieces of tomato, added black pepper and a pinch of sugar. The gravy simmered gently, slowly thickening, and coating the spoon with a reddish-brown layer. The biscuits were split in half, and their soft centers caught the hot gravy. That can of tomatoes could be served with rice, grits, mashed potatoes, or biscuits. The grease saved from the previous meal gave the entire skillet a meaty flavor, even though not a single slice of meat remained on the plate. It's 1 can of tomatoes calls the whole family to the table. Dish number 14, mock ham salad. In 1975 in Toledo, Ohio, about $1.35 could prepare 6 sandwiches for school or the factory. The bologna cost about 75 cents. The mayonnaise and pickles about 25 cents. The white bread another 35 cents. The hand-cranked meat grinder was clamped tightly to the edge of the table. She cut the bologna into pieces, small enough to fit into the grinder, and turned the handle. The pink meat fell into the bowl in small bits. The pickles were drained, finely chopped, and mixed with mayonnaise, mustard, and a little black pepper. The mixture had to be soft enough to spread while still keeping some texture. 6 slices of bread were laid out in a row. She divided the filling with a spoon, folded each sandwich closed, and wrapped it in wax paper. If she made the filling on Sunday night, she kept it tightly covered and spread it on the bread the next morning so the sandwiches would remain just soft enough. Before the worker walked out the door, the metal lunchbox closed with a short, crisp snap. Inside were sandwiches, filling divided evenly, and a lunch substantial enough to satisfy. The lunchbox was still packed full. The bread had helped food leave the kitchen and travel with the worker. But when cooking time also became scarce, tin cans, sheets of aluminum foil, and dinners that dirtied very few utensils began appearing more often on the table. Tin cans, aluminum foil, and dinners. With less cleanup from the sandwiches wrapped before dawn, the kitchen moved on to a different kind of calculation. In families where someone left home early or returned after the second shift, time also became a precious ingredient. Tin cans, aluminum foil, and a hot skillet helped the meal arrive at the right moment, when hands were already tired, but someone in the house was still waiting. Dish number 13, fried Spam and eggs. In 1976, in Waipahu and Honolulu on the island of Oahu, about $1.29 could provide breakfast for 4 people. A can of Spam cost around 62 cents, 6 eggs cost 39 cents, bread cost 18 cents, and the remaining butter or oil cost about 10 cents. The can was opened with its small metal key. The block of meat slid out of the container, releasing its familiar, deeply salty smell. She placed it on the cutting board, cut it evenly into 8 or 9 slices, and laid each slice in the hot skillet. A sharp sizzle rose the moment the meat touched the cast iron. The edges of the Spam darkened, it curled slightly, and glistened in the fat that had just rendered out. When one side had browned, she turned each slice and moved it to the side of the skillet. The eggs were cracked into the remaining fat, their whites spreading out and gradually crisping at the edges. The bread popped out of the toaster at almost the same moment. Each plate received a portion of meat, 1 egg, and a slice of hot toast. The single can sat quietly in the cupboard for weeks. Then on the morning it was needed most, it began the workday. Dish number 12, baked hot dogs and canned. In 1973, in Lowell and Lawrence, Massachusetts, 6 servings of baked hot dogs and beans cost about $1.01. The hot dogs accounted for 48 cents, the canned beans for 38 cents, and the ketchup, mustard, and sugar for about 15 cents. She opened 2 cans of beans, poured them directly into a baking dish, and sliced the hot dogs diagonally. The thin slices looked more plentiful and also had more surface area to brown. Ketchup, yellow mustard, a little brown sugar, and finely chopped onion were mixed directly in the dish. The spoon swept through the thick sauce, leaving reddish-brown trails across the surface of the beans. In the oven, moisture evaporated slowly. The sauce thickened around the edges. The sugar began to caramelize, and the hot dog slices darkened and charred slightly along the rims. When the dish was set on the table, the sweet, salty, smoky aroma spread through the room before the sound of spoons touching plates. That meal was made for weeknights, when the adults had returned home after a long shift. Few utensils, little time, but there was still a hot dish in the center of the table divided into 6 servings. A weeknight dinner still had a dignity of its own. Dish number 11, foil-packed dinners. In 1974, Minnesota and Wisconsin, about $1.52 was enough to make 4 to 6 packets. The ground beef cost 88 cents, the potatoes 23 cents, the carrots and onion 26 cents, the butter and aluminum foil about 15 cents. She tore the foil into large sheets and arranged them in a row on the table. The potatoes were thinly sliced, the carrots cut into smaller pieces, the onion divided into portions. The vegetables went on the bottom. The ground beef was seasoned with salt, pepper, and garlic powder, then shaped into flat patties and placed on top. A small piece of butter completed each portion before the edges of the foil were folded over and rolled tightly closed. In the oven, each packet was held in the steam and meat juices. When opened, the aromas of potatoes, onion, and beef rose all at once. The liquid collected at the bottom had soaked into the vegetables, making each portion both tender and richly flavored. Whoever came home late still had an unopened packet waiting, sealed and ready to be reheated. The convenience here was arranged by hand. Every portion was divided in advance. Every person was taken into account. Each child had a packet of their own. Beside the recipe box was a church cookbook with a thin cover and a plastic spiral binding. Beneath each dish, the contributor's name was neatly typed. Some pages still bore butter stains, a few corners had softened from kitchen steam. In the margins were short penciled notes: add 1 can of beans, use half a pound of meat, and enough for 8 people. Those books preserved the ways a community answered that same question: how to feed many people with money that had originally been meant to feed fewer. Some answers came from cans. Others traveled with immigrants into the steel cities, where cabbage, rice, and a small portion of meat became food for an entire neighborhood. Cabbage, wooden skewers, and the industrial belt. From tin cans and foil packets, the story moves into cities where factory smoke hung over rooftops, and shift-change whistles echoed through red brick neighborhoods. In Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and the Great Lakes region, dinner still carried memories of the old country. Cabbage, rice, ground meat, and a wooden skewer were transformed by immigrant hands into dishes that were both economical and formal enough to bring the whole family closer together around the table. PT-style stuffed cabbage rolls. In 1974 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 6 servings of stuffed cabbage rolls cost about $1.47. The beef accounted for 88 cents, the cabbage 20 cents, the rice 9 cents, and the tomato sauce about 30 cents. In Slovak and Slovenian steelworker families, a small amount of meat was stretched further with rice, cabbage leaves, and the sauce surrounding the pot. The woman cut out the hard core, placed the whole cabbage in boiling water, and used tongs to remove each leaf as it softened. Steam carrying the smell of green vegetables spread throughout the kitchen. The thick veins were trimmed down so the leaves could be folded by hand without tearing. The beef was mixed with rice, onion, egg, salt, and pepper. A spoonful of filling was placed near the stem end of each leaf. The 2 sides were folded inward, and the entire leaf was rolled into a small bundle. The rolls were packed closely together with the folded edges facing down. Sweet and tangy tomato sauce flowed through every gap, while broth kept the leaves tender through hours of slow braising. When served, each person received an individual portion, even though the amount of meat inside was only enough to provide flavor. Small rolls fed a large table. Dish number 9, Polish-style stuffed cabbage rolls. 1 year later, in Cleveland's Slavic village, the smell of slowly braised cabbage often traveled through the hallway before the tray appeared. In 1975, 6 servings cost about $1.80. A mixture of beef and pork accounted for 95 cents, the cabbage 22 cents, the rice 12 cents, and the tomatoes, broth, and sour cream about 51 cents. Cabbage leaves were softened one layer at a time. Torn leaves and leftover pieces were chopped and spread across the bottom of the baking dish to keep the rolls from burning. The filling, made with 2 kinds of meat, rice, sautéed onion, egg, salt, and pepper, was seasoned more strongly because the cabbage leaves and rice would soften the flavor as they braised. Each roll was arranged neatly. Then the tomatoes and broth were poured around them. The dish was covered tightly. Inside, the steam softened the leaves, infused the meat with flavor, and deepened the sauce. When served, a cool spoonful of sour cream was placed alongside, creating a flavor distinctly different from the Pittsburgh version. The difference lay in the filling, the sauce, and the way the dish was served. Those small details helped a community preserve its own distinct voice. Its recipes traveled with immigrants. Dish number 8, mock chicken legs. In 1974, in Cleveland and Pittsburgh, 6 mock chicken leg skewers cost about $1.57. Pork and veal accounted for $1.15, the egg and breadcrumbs about 20 cents, and the broth about 22 cents. The wooden skewers were lined up across the table. Meat was cut into small cubes and threaded onto the skewers in alternating pieces, or shaped around each stick into an oblong form. Each skewer was then rolled in flour, dipped in beaten egg, and coated with breadcrumbs. Oil crackled when the coating touched the skillet. The cook turned each skewer until evenly browned, then transferred them to a baking dish with a layer of broth at the bottom. The meat continued to tenderize as it braised, the coating on top remained slightly crisp, and the underside absorbed the rich flavor of the broth. Placed beside mashed potatoes and brown gravy, those meat skewers looked like a Sunday dish that had taken a long time to prepare. The name suggested chicken, but the memory belonged to the Polish and Ukrainian families who brought the technique into the industrial cities. The mock dish, a real memory. Leaving the steel neighborhoods behind, the list returns to cornmeal, cast iron skillets, and the things that had to be used before the cold season passed through the garden: cornmeal, late season garden, and western casseroles. Leaving the steel neighborhoods behind, the story returns to the bag of cornmeal on the shelf and the green tomatoes remaining in the garden. In those kitchens, people saw a meal in what they already had. Cornmeal and late-season vegetables kept the table standing for one more day. Dish number 7, tamale pie. In 1975, in San Bernardino and Los Angeles, the aroma of cumin and chili from a baking dish could travel through the entire house. 6 servings cost about $1.75. The beef accounted for 95 cents, the cornmeal for 18 cents, the tomatoes, corn, and beans for about 47 cents, and the seasonings and a little cheese for about 15 cents. She browned the beef with onion, drained off some of the fat, and then added canned tomatoes, corn, beans, and seasonings. The filling was cooked until it thickened, then spread in a thin layer across the bottom of the baking dish. In another bowl, the cornmeal was mixed with milk, egg, salt, and baking powder. She spread the mixture over the top, smoothed the surface with the back of a spoon, and sprinkled on a very thin layer of cheese. In the oven, the filling bubbled around the edges. The cornmeal topping gradually turned golden, cracked into fine lines, and released the gently sweet aroma of toasted corn. This was an Americanized casserole version, carrying flavors reminiscent of tamales, but made to be divided quickly among 6 plates. The thin layer of meat was supported by beans, corn, and cornmeal. One baking dish carried many regions. Dish number 6, fried cornmeal cakes. Before dawn in 1972, in Harlan County, Kentucky, 37 cents was enough to make 8 to 10 cakes. The cornmeal cost 12 cents, the buttermilk 10 cents, the egg 6 cents, and the fat and salt about 9 cents. She poured the cornmeal into a bowl and mixed it with salt and a little baking powder. In an enamel cup, the egg was beaten with the buttermilk and then poured into the dry ingredients. The spoon made only a few turns, just enough to keep the mixture light. The cast iron skillet was already hot on the stove. She dropped in a small bit of batter to test it. A sharp, clean sizzle announced that the fat was ready. Spoonfuls of batter were dropped into the skillet, spreading into slightly uneven circles. The edges gradually dried, and small bubbles appeared on the surface. Only then did she turn them, allowing the other side to brown more quickly. The cakes were stacked and eaten with molasses, eggs, beans, or a little butter. The leftovers could be reheated or broken into milk. Before the mine whistle sounded across the valley, breakfast was already hot on the plate. Dish number 5, fried green tomatoes. In 1974, around Cincinnati and the Ohio River Valley, the first cold spell of the season sent baskets of green tomatoes rushing indoors. A large plateful cost about 41 cents, including 25 cents for the tomatoes if they had to be purchased, 8 cents for cornmeal, and 8 cents for frying fat. For a family with a garden, the tomatoes had already been provided by the season. She selected the firm ones, washed them, and cut them into moderately thick slices. Cornmeal was mixed with salt, pepper, and sometimes a little flour. Each tomato slice was pressed gently into the mixture so that both sides were evenly coated. When the tomatoes touched the cast iron skillet, oil sang around their edges. She left each slice undisturbed until the underside turned deep golden, then flipped it once. The coating remained crisp while the inside grew hot and still held the fresh tartness of unripe fruit. Those green tomatoes had once been at risk of being ruined by frost. Through hands that understood the seasons, it became a dish people looked forward to beside the stove. The garden was eaten down to its final fruit. The recipe box was opened again. Cornmeal dust still clung to the cracks in the wood. Beneath the cards lay a grocery receipt from 1974, a scrap of paper listing potatoes, beans, canned tomatoes, and cornmeal. A few coins rested silently at the bottom. The box held more than recipes. It held the way a family divided its money across an entire week, the way the seasons entered the evening meal, and the way ordinary ingredients were given greater value. As the list neared its end, food moved away from the small skillet and into larger baking dishes. Ahead were the church basement, the Sabbath, and the New England kitchen, where egg noodles, butter biscuits, and ground beef kept many people seated together around the table. Egg noodles, butter crackers, and baking dishes waiting for the whole family. As the list draws closer to its end, small skillets gradually give way to baking dishes and deep pots. Egg noodles, cream soup, crushed crackers, and ground beef enter the kitchen looking ordinary, but when placed in the center of the table, they create the feeling of a gathering. Some casseroles are carried down to a church basement. Some accompany the Sabbath. Some pots appear in the middle of the week, just after the coats have been hung up, and everyone listens to the spoon tapping against the side of the pot. Dish number 4, budget lasagna-style noodle bake. In 1977 in Youngstown, Ohio, about $2.85 could make a casserole large enough to serve 6 to 8 people. The beef accounted for $1.10, the egg noodles 42 cents, the cottage cheese 70 cents, the tomato sauce and cheese topping about 63 cents. She browned the beef with onion, drained off some of the fat, and poured in the tomatoes. The smell of dried garlic and herbs gradually filled the kitchen. Its wide egg noodles were boiled until just tender drained and arranged over the first layer of sauce. The cottage cheese was mixed with egg, pepper, and a little grated cheese and spread in alternating layers between the noodles and meat. The layers rose until the baking dish was full. For the first half of the baking time, the dish was tightly covered so the noodles would soften. When the covering was removed, the cheese began to brown, while the meat sauce simmered around the edges. She let the casserole rest before cutting it, waiting for each layer to settle beneath the knife. Egg noodles and cottage cheese replaced more expensive ingredients, but every piece still contained meat, sauce, and a soft, creamy layer. A substitute dish was still preserved on Sunday. Dish number 3, hot chicken, salad casserole. In 1976, community meals held by Lutheran churches in Minnesota, about $2.42, was enough to make an 8-serving casserole. The chicken cost $1.15, the cream soup 32 cents, the mayonnaise and cheese 52 cents, the buttery crackers 25 cents, and the celery, onion, and lemon about 18 cents. She pulled the remaining meat from around the chicken bones, shredded it, and mixed it with thinly sliced celery, chopped onion, cream soup, mayonnaise, and a little lemon juice. The mixture was spread into an aluminum pan ready for the journey from a private kitchen to the fellowship hall. The buttery crackers were placed in a bag and crushed with a glass bottle. The crumbs crackled as they broke beneath the paper. She mixed them with melted butter, scattered them over the top, and covered even the small corners. When the casserole was opened in the church basement, the golden topping broke gently beneath the large serving spoon. Underneath was hot chicken, tender and mildly rich. The recipe could be doubled, kept warm for a long time, and served quickly to people seated in rows. One casserole was enough for an entire row of tables. Dish number 2, sweet noodle kugel. In 1976 in Brooklyn, New York, 8 servings of kugel cost about $2.11. The egg noodles accounted for 45 cents, the cheese and sour cream 88 cents, the eggs 25 cents, and the butter, sugar, raisins, and topping made up the rest. The noodles were boiled until just tender and mixed with butter while still hot. In a large bowl, she beat the eggs with sugar, vanilla, cottage cheese, and sour cream. The raisins were rinsed, drained, and dropped into the mixture a small handful at a time. The noodles were gently folded into the egg and cream mixture, keeping the long strands intact. The baking dish was buttered, mixture spread evenly, and the top covered with cinnamon, sugar, and cereal crumbs. In the oven, the smell of vanilla and butter traveled through every room. The edges turned brown, the top became lightly crisp, and the center remained soft and rich. Kugel accompanied the Sabbath, a holiday, or a family gathering. The smell of cinnamon appeared like a sign, announcing that the house was moving to a different rhythm that day. One casserole accompanied the day of rest. Dish number 1, American beef and macaroni. In 1977, in Worcester and Lowell, Massachusetts, 6 servings cost about $2.30. The beef accounted for $1.05. The elbow macaroni 35 cents. The tomatoes and sauce 58 cents. The onion, seasonings, and a little cheese made up the rest. New Englanders often called the dish American chop suey. In a deep pot, she broke the beef into small pieces and let them brown against the bottom. Onion and bell pepper were added. Crushed tomatoes, tomato sauce, water, pepper, garlic powder, and a little Worcestershire sauce came together into a dark red liquid. The dry elbow macaroni was poured directly into the pot. She covered it, lowered the heat, and occasionally stirred from the bottom. The macaroni absorbed the tomato liquid, the starch thickened the sauce, and the beef spread through every ladleful. When the pot was just done, she sprinkled a little cheese over each bowl so that even the small amount remained clearly visible to everyone. The dish appeared on a Tuesday night, a Wednesday night, or any day when the whole family needed a hot meal. Children might grow up and forget the price of beef, forget the bills, and forget how quickly the grocery bag had emptied. But they remembered the smell of tomatoes as soon as they walked through the door. They remembered the sound of the wooden spoon stirring in the pot. They remembered 6 bowls being set down almost at the same time. That was the smell of family. When the beef and macaroni card was set down, the 25 dishes no longer stood apart. It became a week of grocery shopping, one kitchen, one table, and a pair of hands that knew how to measure everything through experience. The 25 dishes have passed through American working-class kitchens, from the pot of chili in Fort Worth, Monday red beans in New Orleans, and potatoes in a skillet in Pennsylvania coal country to breakfast spam in Hawaii. The cabbage rolls of Pittsburgh, Appalachian cornmeal cakes, trays of chicken in a Minnesota church basement, and New England beef and noodle pots all tell the same story. The woman in the kitchen saved the fat, but soaked the beans the night before, waited for the potatoes to form a crust, returned the bone to the pot, and sprinkled a little cheese over each bowl. She called it making dinner. The bowls called it care. The final card was placed back inside the wooden box. A tomato stain remained on one corner, and the handwritten date 1977 had faded. At the bottom of the box were a few grains of cornmeal, a scrap of paper listing the price of beans, and the scent of vanilla that had seeped into the grain of the wood. The lid closed. The steam on the window slowly disappeared, but the memory remained. Which of these dishes once appeared in your family's kitchen? Write the name of the dish and the region where you grew up. If this story takes you back to an old kitchen, subscribe so that each week we can open another card together. Pull up a chair, 1 can of beans, 1 potato, 1 old bone, and the kitchen still found a way to feed the whole family.